Daf Yomi, Tractate Bava Batra, page 95. Top of the page, the words Hasam, Hain, Chasar, Hain, Yasir. Okay. Hain, Chasar, Hain, Yasir, Amar Le. Mi, Rav Yehoshua, there. In the case of the sale of land, the reason the buyer may keep the extra land when it is less than the acceptable limit is that the seller said to him, I'm selling you this piece of land whether it is slightly less or slightly more than a Beit Kor. Meaning, he agrees to accept a small deviation from the stated area. But while an extra quarter kav area per Beit Sa'ah is not significant, and therefore the seller is willing to forgo it more than a quarter kav area per Beit Sa'ah is significant, and the seller is not willing to forgo any of it. Consequently, all of the extra land must be returned. By contrast, in the case of Rav Huna's ruling, the buyer is aware that it is normal to have a certain proportion of impurities mixed in and accepts this possibility from the outset. Accordingly, even the proportion of impurities is greater than the acceptable limit. It might be sufficient if the seller takes back only the quantity of impurities above the acceptable limit. If the Gemara explains why more than an area required to sow a quarter kav of seed per Beit Sa'ah of land is significant. The reason is that since all those extra areas of land are fit to combine together to form an area in which one could sow 9 kav of seed, the extra land is a significant plot of land in its own right, and therefore it must all be returned. The land that was sold was stated to be a Beit Kor, which is 30 Beit Sa'ah. If the area of the extra land was of a proportion somewhat more than an area required to sow a quarter kav of seed per Beit Sa'ah of land, then 30 such areas would collectively be about equal to an area required to sow 9 kav. Toshima Oina pachos mishtus nikna mikach yosim mishtus batal mikach shtus kane umachzir no. The Gemara suggests commentaries support for Rav Huna's ruling from a Braita. The halacha of price exploitation is that if the disparity is less than 1/6 of the value of the merchandise is acquired immediately, and the sum of the exploitation need not be returned. If the disparity is greater than 1/6, then the transaction is nullified. If the disparity is precisely 1/6, the buyer has acquired the merchandise, and the one who benefited from the exploitation returns the entire sum of the exploitation. The Gemara explains the proof why, in the case where the disparity is precisely 1/6, the entire sum of the exploitation is returned. Instead, let him return only a small amount of the exploitation until the difference is less than 1/6. The Gemara concludes, learn from the fact that he must return the entire sum, that when one is required to return part of a sale because of a discrepancy that is beyond the acceptable limit of deviation, one is required to return the entire discrepancy and not just the amount that is beyond the acceptable limit. This supports Rav Huna's ruling. Hachi hashta hasim mikara shava b'shaveh amar le mi upachas mishtus lo yadi avimona umechalinish tus yadia v'lo mechalinish Yeser mishtus mikach ta'us mekach ta'usu batel mekach. The Gemara rejects this. How can these cases be compared? There, in the case of exploitation, the seller initially said to the buyer that he would sell the merchandise for a sum equal to its value. Any price difference should be unacceptable. But a disparity of less than 1/6 is not recognizable in a sale worth 100 dinars, and a person will forego it. By contrast, a disparity of 1/6 is considered significant, and a person will not forego it. Consequently, the entire sum of exploitation, must be returned. If the disparity is greater than 1/6, it is a mistaken transaction, and the transaction is nullified. By contrast, in the case of Rav Huna's ruling, the buyer is aware that it is normal to have a certain proportion of impurities mixed in, and accepted that possibility from the outset. Accordingly, even if the proportion of impurities was greater than the acceptable limit, it might be sufficient if the seller takes back only the quantity of impurities above the acceptable limit. Tashima, Makabel Sadim Chaveralita, Harez Makabel Olav Eser Borios Lamea, Yoser Mikam Nigalgalin Olav Esakoid. The Gemara suggests, coming here, a support for Huna's ruling from a Brayta. When one receives a field from another under a contract to plant trees in it, then this field owner accepts upon himself that there may be 10 deficient trees per every 100 trees planted, as he is aware that not every tree is planted will necessarily flourish. If the number of deficient trees is more than this, the court imposes upon him the responsibility to replace all of those trees, and not only the number of trees above the acceptable limit. This supports Rav Huna's ruling. Amar Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yehoshua. Kol yeser mikan kabalita mitchila damim. Rav Huna son of Yehoshua said there is no proof in this case, because any time there are more than this number of deficient trees, the overall area that contains the deficient trees is of a size equivalent to a whole field. Therefore, the contractor is comparable to one who comes to plant a whole field from the outset, who has not fulfilled his remit if he plants only a few trees. Rather, he must plant the entire area. But in the case of Rav Huna's ruling, the impurities never constitute an independent unit. Consequently, it might be sufficient if the seller takes back only the quantity of impurities that is above the acceptable limit. Martiv shel yayin, we said in the Mishnah, Martiv shel yayin. Hechidami, what's it talking about? Idam le martiv shel yayin stam kashya. Idam le martiv shel yayin kashya. The Mishnah teaches when purchasing a cellar containing barrels of wine, a martef, 680, 720. One accepts upon himself that up to 10 barrels of souring wine may be present in each 100 barrels purchased. The Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of the sale? If one said to the buyer, I am selling to you a wine cellar, without specification of which cellar he meant, it is difficult, as the Gemara will soon explain. And if he said to him, I am selling to you this particular wine cellar, it is difficult. No, it's in the shikula yofe martiv ze shel yain ani moicher loch no isin loy yain nimper v'chanus martiv ze ani moicher loch afilu kula choymet higiya. The Gemara elaborates. If he said to him, I am selling to you this particular wine cellar, it is difficult, as it is taught in a Brayta. If one said to a buyer, I am selling to you a wine cellar, then he is required to give him wine that is all of good quality, meaning the buyer does not have to accept any quantity of souring wine. He said, I am selling to you this particular wine cellar, that he may give him the wine that is in his possession, even if it's of the quality that is sold in the shops. Meaning it is beginning to sour. If he said, I'm selling to you this particular seller without mentioning the word wine, then even if everything gives him wine that turned into vinegar, it has come to the buyer and the sale is valid. The Mishnah is ruling that the buyer must accept that up to 10% of wine might be sour and does not accord with any of the rulings of the Braita. L'olam di Omar le martiv shel yayin stam v'tani reisha b'reisha the Braita mekabel of eser kosot the mea. The Gemara answers actually the Mishnah concerns a case when he said to the buyer, I'm selling you a wine cellar, without specification of which seller he was selling, and demand the Braita and teach the following qualification. In the first clause of the Braita, and the buyer accepts upon himself that up to 10 barrels of souring wine may be present in each 100 barrels purchased. Uvistam mimekapel. No, it's in a yain. Shani chov is to cholichat chamrahu. The Gemara challenges this addition, but if he sold the buyer wine cellar without specification of which one he was selling, does the buyer accept upon himself any souring wine at all? Did Rabbi Chia teach one who sells a barrel of wine to another must give him wine that is all of good quality? The Gemara answers the barrel is different because the wine inside is all one body of wine of the same quality. Hatani Razvid the Yehoshua martiv shel yain ani moichelach nois in yain shkuliofe martiv ze shel yain ani moichelach nois in yain shkuliofe mekabel eser koises lemea. The Gemara once again challenges the addition, but in Razvid teach a Braita of the school of Yehoshua. If one says to a buyer, I'm selling you a wine cellar, then he is required to give him wine that is all good quality. Similarly, if he said, I'm selling you this particular wine cellar, then he is required to give him wine that is all of good quality, but the buyer accepts upon himself 10 souring barrels per 100 barrels.